Amen. Wow, what a service. We're so glad that you are all here. We are looking at Genesis chapter 12 today, where God suddenly speaks to a man named Abram, who will later be named Abraham, when God says, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you." Now, it's important to understand where this happens in the world. This happens in a place that was called Ur at the time, and Ur is right here. Now, while we think about Ur as being a space here, it's important to understand that Abram thought of Ur as being a space here. There was a lot of unknown when God says to Abram, "Go," and Abram says, "Into the blank space, into the space that is unknown," and God says, "That is exactly where I am calling you." God then goes on to say, "I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great so that you will exemplify divine blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you, I will curse. And in you, all the families on earth shall be blessed." And we don't get much of a response from Abram verbally, but with his actions we read, "So Abram went as the Lord told him." Now, upon reading this story, there is one word that pops into my mind immediately, and that word is, wait a second. Because we skipped over a major part of this story, didn't we? Because apparently, Abram, who just says, "Hey, God called me to leave my parents behind," had to at some point go to his parents and say, "God is telling me to leave you behind." What happened in that conversation? And what's interesting is, while I think of this as a pivotal moment, I can't imagine what it would be like to tell my parents, "Hey, I have to leave you." And they say, "Why?" And like, "Well, because God told me to." I can't imagine that. What's really interesting is if you search on Google Images, there's not a lot of pictures of Abram talking to his father Terah saying, "Hey, I've got to leave." Instead, you can find lots of pictures of Abram sacrificing his son Isaac, but none of him talking to his dad saying, "It's time for me to go." And when I hear these words, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land I will show you," I think about Abram and the family that he belonged to. Not only that, but in the previous chapter, we read an extensive genealogy from Noah all the way to Abram, 10 generations. And if you read the text closely, you realize that God speaks to Abram for the first time in this family since God spoke to Noah 10 generations ago. So I assume Abram went to his father Terah and said, "God spoke to me," and Terah would say, "Really? What makes you think you're so special? Because God has not spoken to me this whole time." And yet that's exactly how the story unfolds. Now, let's assume that we could have Abram here with us this day. What question would you ask him about this story? Because I know the question I would ask him. I would say, "So Abram, what did your parents think about all of this? Please tell me," because that's completely silent in the text, and it's what I want to know. Because I want to tell you all something. When you go and start your own church, people love to tell you what they think, whether you ask them or not. And I will tell you that I've answered a lot of theological questions in my day, but by far and away, the number one question I've been asked the last 5 years that's a theological question more than anything about this church that we started is this: "So Craig, what do your parents think about all this?" Like, what do they think about you going outside of the fold, outside of a denomination, and starting your own thing? And my response is, well, they're in the front row. You can just go ask them. And while this is my story, and it's not necessarily everybody's story, this story of Abram is owned by the Jewish community, but it's also a universal story for all of us. When I speak with queer folks, I so often hear about their coming out story, and as they're friends of mine, there eventually becomes a question, which is, "So, what do your parents think about all of this, about you coming out?" And there are stories of healing and hope and beauty, and there are also stories of rejection and anger and heartache. And yet this question represents so much more than just what two or few others think about this story that happened. I think about my own marriage, which I got married just over 12 years ago to a beautiful woman named Kimmy. And the fact is, it's really easy for us to get married in 2010, whereas if we were born in 1910, it would have been really difficult and illegal in California due to the fact that interracial marriage was outlawed. And I look at these pictures and I feel an immense sense of gratitude for all the generations that went before us who had to endure the questions from their friends, so what do your parents think about all of this? Not only that, but I think of people who've gone through divorce. And divorce is something that is so hard for people to talk about. And yet, when you're friends with somebody and you ask them how they are going through it and you hear their story, they eventually say, so what do your parents think about all this? This question recognizes that our lives do not go according to our parents' plan, right? And I have to tell you something. We have this idea that people who have things really together, their life unfolded perfectly according to their parents' plan, right? But I have to tell you, I've never met a 25-year-old who said, or a parent of a 25-year-old who said, my kid turned out to be exactly the person I expected them to be. Conversely, I've never heard a 25-year-old say, I've never disappointed my parents. And it's important for us to acknowledge this because that's what this story is. Yes, it's about Abram's relationship with his parents, but it's about so much more because Abram was expected to stay. And God intervenes and says, no, I want you to go. And every one of us at some point faces the question, should I stay within the confines of what is expected of me, or should I go where God calls me? And what's really brilliant about the text is the fact that Genesis 12 says, God says to Abram, hey, you're going to go bless some people, but some of them are going to curse you. No matter how much you try to help others, there will be some backlash on that. And what's interesting about this story is following God is going to disappoint some people in your life. It's baked into the text. So a couple of thoughts on this from Genesis 12. What's important for us all to know is that we do not follow a God who is a God of the status quo. God does not call us to say, just keep doing what you're doing, you're killing it. That's not who God is. Yes, God affirms who we are. God values who we are, God accepts us as we are, but God also calls us to new and better ways of loving one another. Amen. There are others here in this room who are deciding whether it's time to go or it's time to stay. I want you to know I've been there professionally. And I found that it's time to go when it's easier than continuing to stay. If it takes less energy to go forward than it does to stay going backwards, that's when you know it's time to go. Lastly, if you follow God's call, then you will disappoint some. However, following God's call is God's greatest gift to all of us, isn't it? God created you to be the person exactly that you are. And so that will be different than what other people expect of you. That will be different than what society tells you you are supposed to be. And that's okay because we do not serve a society. We serve the all-powerful God. My friends, when I think of this story of Abram, my wish for you this morning is that we may all have the courage of Abram. May we all go where God calls us, and may this movement that God calls us into bless others. Amen.
Well, Craig, I hope I'm where you are in 9 years. Whew, whew. And I'm going to share with you a little bit about this week's Parsha, which in the Jewish community we call Lach. And in our Jewish tradition, we read a different chapter of Torah each week. And it has a title based on the most important word in the first verses. So Craig already told you we're in Genesis chapter 12. This Parsha is called Lech Lecha. And I'll give a little nod to Craig's sermon further along in mine. But I'm going to talk about something a little different. Let me help you enter into the text first. I'm going to read it in Hebrew, and then don't worry, I'll translate. Vayomer Adonai el Avram, lech lecha, me'artzecha, u'memoledetcha, u'mebeit avicha el haaretz asher arecha. Adonai said to Abram, because he's not Abraham yet, he gets an added hey, one of the letters of God's name later on. Adonai said to Abram, go forth from your native land, from your father's house to the land that I will show you. Abram is told to lech lecha, to go forth. He's being told to go forth towards himself. The Hebrew lech means to go. Lecha means to go toward you. Exactly. You got it. Sermon done. No, just kidding. Jews believe there is no mistaken word in our Torah. Each and every word has deep meaning. And so if there's a little repetition or a little difference, it's for a reason. It's for us to notice. The going forth of Abraham, who is clearly called on this Hebrew's journey, is a going forth for himself. So God continues to command with all kinds of directions and all kinds of promises. And in our Jewish tradition, we look at scholars, we look at what we call the commentaries to teach us a little bit more about the deeper meaning. So I'm going to introduce you to three main scholars this morning. We'll start with Rashi. Rashi is one of the most famous and kind of one of the most difficult, because instead of giving you an answer about what a verse means, he gives you a question. And he gives you the answer to the question that he's asking, but he doesn't give you the question. So you have to figure out what is the question he's asking and what is he saying. I'll save you from that journey. I'll go directly to the meaning. But Rashi is known as Rabbi Solomon ben Isaac Shlomo Yitzchaki, and Rashi is the acronym for his name, but we just call him Rashi. It's the Hebrew initials. And he's one of our most famous Jewish commentators in history. He was born in Troyes, Champagne in northern France in 1040. So Rashi says about Lech Lecha, that verse, he says, it means go for thyself, for thy own benefit, for your own good. Wow, right? You just want to pause there for a moment. Rashi is teaching us that this Hebrew's journey for Abram is for his benefit. So what if we saw paradox and Beit Ahava? What if we saw our own choices? Not only is God calling us to those choices, but that those choices are for our benefit, for our life, and for those who come after us. Now let's go to Ibn Ezra, another famous commentator. His name is Abraham Ibn Ezra. He's a poet, a philosopher, a grammarian, a biblical exegete, and he lived from 1089 to 1164. He was born in Tudela, Spain, where he lived until he left to wander, like so many of our people. And he's also very well known for his commentary. So what does he say about Lech Lecha? Ibn Ezra says, God calls Abraham to leave his country, his place of birth. He specifically calls out his father's house because God knew, although Abram was on this journey to Canaan, he knew that Abram's father, Terach, who Craig was teaching us about before, would end up settling not too far from his home, and perhaps Abram would want to stay there instead of continuing on his journey. So he wanted to ensure that Abram continued this journey all the way. And so he showed him to the land that I will show you, which is the land of Canaan. So he perhaps supports most of your sermon, Craig, by saying, keep going, even when you're pulled back to that loved one who might settle a little closer, you got to keep going. So Beit Ahava and paradox, keep going. Don't stop. Your parents love you wherever they are. You have your own journey. So now one last scholar, and I promise you that I'll just share a little more teaching. This is also one of the most famous of our Jewish scholars, Rambam. His name is Moshe ben Maimon. We call him Rambam. Again, it's an acronym. He was born in 1138. Maimonides is his name in a Greek translation, just to confuse you a little more. And he's known by the acronym Rambam. He grew up in what is known as Cordoba, Spain. So what does Rambam teach about Lech Lecha? He teaches Going forth, lecha, towards thyself, is for your own benefit, for your own good. This journey is one that is blessed for you, Abram. So I ask you this beautiful Shabbat morning, what journey have you been putting off? Beit Ahava. What is your next step, Paradox? If you knew that God was speaking to you this morning, this week, this year, this month, and told you you would be blessed, and this journey was for your benefit, for your own good, what might you leave here today and begin this exact moment? And I bring you the words of our tradition. Lech lecha, go forth from your father's house to the land that I will show you, because I will make your name great. This is God speaking, not me. I will make a nation of you, and you will have as many descendants as the stars. So why, Paradox, is this Torah portion called Lech lecha? Why is it translated as go forth, but the actual words mean go towards yourself? We've seen 3 different teachings on how we go towards ourselves, but it's not always such an easy task. It's not easy to leave behind that which is beloved to us, that which is our roots, that which has helped us to grow. It's not easy to give progressive theology. It's not easy to start a spiritual community over anew. It's not easy to leave what is familiar. And yet, as Craig said, when it's easier to leave than to stay, you know it's time. So Beit Ahava and Paradox, what is it time for you to leave behind? What is it time for you to follow towards yourself? Have you started a new life's calling? Is it time for you to begin a new career? Is it time for you to start a new family? Have you had a new beginning? In my life, I've had quite a few new beginnings. I'm in the very tip-top of one of them with Beit Ahava, and so grateful for the friendship and the support on this incredible journey. But one of my first new beginnings was after my very first trip to Israel. My grandparents gifted me a trip to Israel when I was in high school, at the end of high school. And I went, and I had no idea that this would be a spiritual reawakening for me. That journey became a pivot of my spiritual renewal. I became very ill when I was in the land of Israel. I actually spent time in the hospital by myself. My parents were told not to come. Would have been handled differently today because they wanted me to finish out the trip and have a positive experience. I certainly did, and here I am. So, as a 16-year-old girl, I began my spiritual quest. I began my journey to becoming a progressive theologian, a feminist, a Jewish woman, a rabbi, a spiritual leader, a multi-faith individual who believes in community. Lech lecha, go towards yourself. Are you being called to start something new, to go back to school, to finally start working towards that career of your dreams? Do you long to get a PhD? Is it time to leave an unhealthy relationship? Whatever you need to do, go towards yourself, Beit Ahava. Go towards yourself, Paradox. Because this week, Torah is calling us, Lech lecha, and reminding us that God is blessing us. God is with us. We are not alone. So some beautiful words from one of my colleagues is what I'll close with this morning, a poem based on this week's Parsha. What falls apart cannot be put back together, but when the sameness crumbles, creation peeks through, daring us, daring you, to reveal your uniqueness, to remove your shell and make your inside out. No, you will never be the same, but becoming always does triumph holding. Because when you let go of old pieces, you fall purposefully into who you are meant to be. Shabbat Shalom Paradox, Shabbat Shalom Beit Ahava.